The book starts with an example of stereotypes. I won't spell out the research behind this. Stereotypes, which a term you already probably know, are stereotypical, simplistic beliefs about a group. All professors, or blah, 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 whatever blah was, that would be a stereotype about professors. But it could be partly right or partly wrong. But if it's a simple thing, it's stereotypes. One could ask the question, how do stereotypes affect people? This is a research question, but it's also a very serious question. In psychology and socially, the two pictures I flashed up are on the left, one of the first people in an integrated high school. It's unbelievable how recently you could be one of the first people in an integrated school in Virginia. It's not like 1804, it's like 1958. So the person who enters that school and inevitably faces a stereotype among the majority population that may hold a stereotype about the intellectual performance of African Americans. Or on the right is meant to illustrate, these stereotypes hopefully are slipping away a bit, but not entirely, gender stereotypes about math. If you ask people, who do you think will have the most excelling math performance, even though men and women or boys and girls in school have similar scores, there's a stereotype. If you ask them to picture a mathematician, you'll picture some guy with weird hair. And putting aside the hair, you'll probably first picture some guy. There's a stereotype about math performance in men, which means that women who enroll in, Calculus 8, Math 10,000, are subjected to implicitly stereotypes in which they're likely a minority person, and there may be stereotypes about them. So then the question is, well, what are the effects of stereotypes? This is what you'll see in the book in every chapter. And this is kind of the thing that ties pieces of psychology together. The question, what are the effects of stereotypes, in the sense is analogous to how does this thing work when it was Angry Birds on an iPhone, in that there's more than one answer, and all the answers, all three of them are correct. There's not an infinity, but there's three types of answers. One, and I'm not making this stuff up, we'll see later in the course, there's research on this. You can run experiments on this by way of preview. The way you run the experiment is sometimes you may put a woman in a room in which there's half men and half women as opposed to mostly men. The presence of lots of men activates the stereotype. Is that kind of manipulation. One thing to say about stereotypes is that they affect people's performance on tests. They actually do. If you run these experiments, if you remind people about stereotypes, you create lots of stereotype stuff and hand them a calculus test, they perform less well than if those same people take the test in a room by themselves or not, or in a room with people of the same gender, or are otherwise not reminded of the stereotype. The manipulations are often a little more subtle than that, but we'll get to that later in the class. So the statement, oh, stereotypes affect people, they can lower people's performance on tests, are correct. Another statement is this. Stereotypes create anxiety that interfere with concentration or memory. Anxiety isn't a person. It's also not a part of the brain. It's an emotional experience. Memory, obviously, isn't a person, and it's also not a part of the brain. It isn't a memory part. Memory is a thing people can do. Remember stuff. Or it's a system in the mind that allows you to do that, analogous to your hard drive and your random access memory. It's a system that allows some unit, like a person or a computer, to remember stuff. At the level of these information processes, stereotypes, and if you run these experiments, you get the same thing. If you measure people's anxiety, it goes up. If you measure the information processing of the mind, concentration abilities go down when you're more anxious, which means, by the way, if you're test anxious and thinking you're underperforming because of anxiety, it's not some dumb excuse. Anxiety, in a sense, uses up, I'll speak loosely, some brain power and causes you to not remember stuff and therefore to perform less well on tests. At the level of the mind, there's a functional link between memory and anxiety. That's a statement that holds true for people in general. It's a statement about the mind. Also, if you stick people in brain imaging devices, which we'll talk about, for now you just need to know, you can take, if you don't already, you can take images of what parts of the brain are most active at a given point in time. Stereotypes activate regions of the brain that we know from other research generate emotional reactions, these brain regions do not help you do well on calculus tests. So a third way of talking about the effects of stereotypes is that there's a direct effect of stereotypes on brain activation. These three statements are related in exactly the same way as it's got a microprocessor, it's running software, it's a game where you fling birds and they land on pigs are related. They're like three ways of saying the same thing at different levels of analysis. So what I haven't done is to give you some dictionary definition of levels of analysis, which in a sense you don't need. That's probably much harder than just illustrating it. So in the same way that you know that physics and chemistry and biology are different levels of analysis, hardware, software, and a video game as a whole, is different levels of analysis. This affects people. Anxiety in the mind impairs memory. This brain system, a biological thing, is activated, are three different statements, but they aren't like weird disconnected statements that have nothing to do with each other. They're in a sense three ways of looking at the same thing. So what you'll see throughout the course is we'll introduce topics all over the course by looking at the experiences of people, and then in a sense go down to look at how the thing works in terms of thinking processes and the brain, in exactly the same way that you might introduce somebody to a smartphone by explaining how it works. You turn it on, you play a game, and if they ask, you'd say it runs software in an operating system. And if they ask, you might say, oh, this is all running on a really, really fast, tiny microprocessor. And you sort of start with the whole thing and go down. And we'll be doing that all over and over. You'll see these images in the book. It's filled with these person, mind, brain images that analyze some question about people in society at these three levels at once. This is obvious, I just said all this. But it's still a fascinating slide that I spent 4 minutes preparing. That each of these statements, look, I even made these arrows myself. That's what you get with your PhD skills. So these statements are correct in exactly the same way that it's obvious at this point that the Angry Bird statements were correct. They aren't identical statements. They don't exactly, if you're really into science, they don't exactly always reduce in a one-to-one manner. Sometimes things are a little more complex than simple, utter scientific reductionism. But nonetheless, the levels sort of all inform one another, and it's often a lot easier to start at the top and work down, and we'll do that consistently.